People assume that they just kind of drilled everything into me and taught me everything, but Dad taught me that for drums, and from there, I just kind of taught myself. Wolfgang Van Halen, son of rock icon Eddie Van Halen, has shocked fans and music industry insiders alike with his incredible metamorphosis. After spending much of his career in the shadow of his famous father, Van Halen's bassist Wolfgang has broken out on his own, demonstrating not just musical prowess but also a remarkable personal transformation that has captivated audiences worldwide. Expectations were sky-high as Wolfgang's quest started, set against the background of a rock and roll dynasty. At first, he gained fame for his musical prowess after performing with his famous father and uncle. But as Wolfgang matured, it became apparent that he was prepared to forge his own path. He has shown signs of a metamorphosis in his life outside music in the past several years. Wolfgang has made positive changes to his body by losing weight and increasing his exercise routine. How did he escape the constraints of society's expectations for him? Where did he encounter difficulties? Come along as we investigate the remarkable metamorphosis of Wolfgang Van Halen and learn about the gifted musician hiding behind the legendary moniker. A little kid named Wolfgang Van Halen entered this world in 1991 into the realm of rock stars and television celebrity. Eddie Van Halen, the guitar prodigy whose groundbreaking methods and scorching solos revolutionized rock music, was his father. His mom was the famous One Day at a Time actress Valerie Bertinelli. Living in the shadow of a legend isn't easy, no matter how famous that legend is, and that was certainly the case for Wolfgang from the start of his incredible existence. As a child, Wolfgang could hear music everywhere. It permeated his entire household, even the air he breathed. His famous guitarist father, Eddie, was among the all-time greats. His lightning-fast fingers could produce unearthly tones. Who could have grown up in such an environment and not be influenced by music? Almost everyone expected Wolfgang to continue in his father's career, but Wolfgang wasn't content to just mimic Eddie. He wanted to forge his own unique identity in the music industry. Wolfgang showed indications of a natural talent for this from an early age. The narrative is beautifully illustrated by a picture of a small child seated at a drum set that is far too large for him, his hands trembling as he struggles to handle the drumsticks. An uncle of Eddie's, Alex Van Halen, who was also a member of the band Van Halen, owned the drum set. Imagine a picture of a child who is already immersed in rock and roll, surrounded by the instruments that will become his tools in the future. It's almost too wonderful to be true. Years later, Wolfgang shared this shot on Instagram with a statement that perfectly captured the moment, whipping out a brief jam session on Uncle AL's equipment while rocking my drumming Uggs. From what he could recall, music had always played a role in his life. His skill really took off when Wolfgang became older. He has his own career as a musician, not only as the son of Eddie Van Halen. He took his drumming seriously by the time he was 9 years old. What had begun as gentle tapping on paper had evolved into a strong, tangible rhythm. The father of Wolfgang Van Halen sat down and taught him just that. Seeing his kid become a drum master excited Eddie Van Halen, the famed guitarist and virtuoso. Eddie could feel his enthusiasm rising as Wolfgang perfectly executed it. His joy was palpable as he rejoiced over the fact that his kid had carried on the family tradition of exceptional musical talent. However, Wolfgang's former years were very ordinary, even though he grew up in a home where musical icons frequented and where inspiration was always in the air. There was no carefree youth here. Valerie Bertinelli, his mother, ensured that while they were in the midst of the exceptional, she kept him anchored in the mundane. When asked about his childhood, Wolfgang admitted he was oblivious to his parents' fame. Like any other child's childhood, it was full of love, laughter, and family memories, but it wasn't extravagant or insane. Wolfgang became the person he is now as a result of this delicate equilibrium. Growing up with two legendary figures, one in rock and one in Hollywood, made sure that he had a purpose in life beyond stardom. He was free to pursue his interests and identify his path. When he did, they encouraged him without coercing him into pursuing music professionally. It's a reflection of their parenting style and the type of person Wolfgang has grown up to be, quiet, gifted, and motivated not by stardom but by a profound affection for music. While Wolfgang Van Halen's childhood was filled with music, he lived a life away from the limelight. Even though young Wolfgang grew up in a world where Eddie Van Halen was a rock star, he had no clue how famous his dad actually was. In an interview with Guitar World, he gave a straightforward and honest response when asked if he acknowledged his dad as a rock god: "Not really." The truth only started to sink in as he began to browse through CDs. Within the covers, he could see a lifelike portrait of his father, a symbol of a realm beyond his own. However, Wolfgang's true awakening occurred when he was around 6 or 7 years old. He had the insatiable need for knowledge that all children have, and one fateful day, he discovered the key to unlocking his world. During his father's time spent remastering old albums with the band, Wolfgang stumbled into a crate containing those same records. As he looked over the credits, his little eyes opened at the sight of his father's photo and his own name. His voice betrayed both his curiosity and his enthusiasm as he sought his father's explanation. Perhaps sensing the critical nature of the occasion, Eddie halted, recognizing that this was his forte. He glanced at his kid and took in the gravity of the situation. All it took was just one sentence to unlock a portal to stardom, music, and legacy. Eddie gave Wolfgang an introduction to the family's background and the music that had an impact on their lives. Discovering not just his father's achievements but also the life they lived together, a life bound by memories and music, was like unearthing a priceless gem. Wolfgang started to adjust to this new world as he got older. Even though his dad was a famous rock musician, he still wanted to be his own man. There will be both successes and failures along the way, but he was prepared for both. As the drums pounded and notes were played, he paid tribute to his father while also shining in his own glory. The adventure had only just begun, but Wolfgang was hellbent on following in his father's footsteps by making music that touched people all across the globe. The events surrounding Wolfgang Van Halen were building to a climax, and they promised to be as dramatic and interesting as those that had preceded him. Wolfgang Van Halen had an innate talent for music even as a child. He devoted a great deal of time to playing the drums, immersing himself in the beat. His famous guitarist father, Eddie Van Halen, was a rock legend in his own right. Teaching such a legend was the stuff of legends for a lot of people. Wolfgang, though, found it to be a little more complex. As he matured, Wolfgang had an increasing attraction to the guitar. As he entered the tumultuous years of puberty, when he began to question everything, his drive to compose music intensified. He aspired to be just like his famous father, but he soon discovered that learning from a rock star was no picnic. In a conversation with Louder Sound, he acknowledged that his father wasn't the most effective educator. Every time he would approach Eddie for a lesson, Eddie would just give him a smile and say, "Do that," referring to his own exceptional playing. Even though it was annoying, Wolfgang thought it was humorous. While Wolfgang was still grasping the fundamentals of magic, he would cynically respond with, "Absolutely no problem," as if Eddie were encouraging him to do the illusion. As a result, Wolfgang decided to take action on his own. He chose not to depend on his father's teachings but instead to educate himself. After seeing his father forge his own musical career, he aspired to do the same. In a conversation with Spin, he discussed how he prioritized honing his unique sound and abilities. He was careful not to come across as a phony cover of the late, great Van Halen. Wolfgang learned most of what he knows on his own, but there was one instance that really stuck out. That was the moment he decided he wanted to sing a certain song. He inherited this instrumental composition from his father for a momentous event, a sixth-grade talent show. Wolfgang wished to perform the meaningful song on this occasion. He sought his father's assistance, and Eddie enthusiastically volunteered. Eddie led Wolfgang through the song as the father and son sat together. In contrast to the typical instructional moments, this one was brimming with affection and camaraderie. Wolfgang picked up on the underlying emotions and melodies. Upon taking the stage, he gave his all to each chord. Wolfgang had a sense of pride as the crowd was enthralled. It felt like he was letting the world in on a little secret from his father's heart. While Wolfgang yearned for a unique voice of his own, he learned from this experience that the link he shared with his father was priceless. Even though Eddie wasn't exactly a textbook instructor, the time they spent together musically was instructive all the same. The presence of Wolfgang's father seemed to follow him wherever he went whenever he took up the guitar. Even as he forged his own path in rock music, he paid homage to the Van Halen moniker with each chord he played. Throughout his musical career, Wolfgang never forgot that moment. It was a sobering reminder that no matter how far he went, he would never truly be apart from his father's heritage, a history brimming with love, skill, and a special connection that no two people could ever fully understand. Wolfgang Van Halen had gone a long way from being Eddie Van Halen's son by 2006. He had established himself as a gifted musician. He was just 15 years old, but his abilities had already blossomed. Because his father saw his son's potential, he took a risk that would alter the course of Wolfgang's life in irrevocable ways. He sent an invitation to Wolfgang, suggesting that he replace Michael Anthony on bass for the famous rock band Van Halen. A lot of people thought he was just doing his son a favor by making this decision, occupational bias, perhaps. However, Eddie did not hesitate to defend his decision. His choice was really motivated by a tale he told in an interview with Guitar World. While drummer Alex Van Halen listened closely, he and Wolfgang were jamming together, completely absorbed in their music. Wolfgang was the source of the incredible basslines that Alex was unaware of. His own nephew was making such noises, and he was both amazed and frightened to hear them. With one key condition, Wolfgang was pleased when Eddie eventually invited him to join the band. A bass solo was something he was jokingly opposed to performing. A fresh chapter began for the father and son at this point. Wolfgang eagerly accepted the offer, prepared to dive headfirst into the rock and roll scene despite his knowledge of how difficult it would be. Still, questions persisted as they set off on the 2007 to 2008 reunion tour alongside David Lee Roth, the band's original lead singer. The inclusion of Wolfgang in the band raised eyebrows among certain fans. He was only seen by them as a nepotism baby, someone who was admitted solely due to his father's connections. Their hurtful comments hurt like hell. In retrospect, Wolfgang did acknowledge that it had been an exceptionally trying experience. At the time, he was ill-prepared to deal with it, and the stress of it all eventually got to him. The weight of the world was on his tiny shoulders, and the negativity was crushing. However, Wolfgang disproved their claims. He proved his worth to the legendary band night after night by taking the stage alongside his uncle and father. He was an integral element of the Van Halen heritage, and his talent and enthusiasm were evident. He was also Eddie Van Halen's son. Wolfgang Van Halen was well known as a gifted musician by the year 2013. Even before Wolfgang was born, his father, Eddie Van Halen, had created the iconic band Van Halen, and he had performed with them on several occasions. He carried the burden of his family's musical heritage with him every time he took the stage. Music was his lifeblood. But in the same year, he shocked the music industry with a statement that rocked the industry to its core. He was joining a different band named Tremonti. Passionately discussing his new job, Wolfgang gave an interview to Billboard, similar to his approach with Van Halen. Wolfgang Van Halen was treating this possibility with the utmost seriousness. Even though his father's band, Van Halen, had a long and storied history, Wolfgang was determined to make his own mark in the music business. Although his family's band was important to him, he knew that his personal growth and independence were even more crucial. Having said that, he was quite forthright about his dedication to his role in Tremonti, which he treated as seriously as any other band he was a part of. Even while Van Halen wasn't performing, it was clear from his remarks that he was dedicated to both groups. He was hellbent on becoming a successful artist on his own, not content to merely follow in his father's footsteps. In an interview with Rock Street Journal, Wolfgang Van Halen discussed his surprising path to joining the hard rock band Tremonti. "It seemed like it was meant to be," he said. "It wasn't a haphazard choice." For a long time, Wolfgang had been acquainted with Creed's lead singer, Mark Tremonti. Their mutual love of music brought them closer, but Wolfgang had no idea that their relationship would take him on such an exciting journey. All of that changed one fateful night in New Jersey. He learned that Tremonti was in dire need of a bass player. They were in the final stages of preparing to embark on a tour, and the clock was ticking. Anxieties and anticipation pervaded the atmosphere like a door flung open. Wolfgang beheld the opportunity and made the decision to leap in. As his heart raced with adrenaline, he arrived at Tremonti's apartment at midnight, prepared to take on the challenge. Time was of the essence, and he needed to memorize the entire repertoire in a single sitting. Despite the difficulty of the mission, Wolfgang remained resolute. He sensed this might be a watershed moment in his career, an opportunity to emerge from his father's shadow and claim his place. Memories of that night, brimming with anticipation and stress, rushed back to him. According to Wolfgang, he learned the entire set in one midnight session. He eagerly took on the task, his thoughts still racing with the exhilaration of that moment. The next day, as he went on tour with Tremonti, he was surrounded by a cacophony of noise and excitement. The world was rocked in 2001 when famed guitarist Eddie Van Halen broke the news that he was battling tongue cancer. Everyone who loved his music, including his family, went through a horrible period. The news cast a shadow over the rock and roll scene. How this musical behemoth could endure such a terrible illness was a mystery to everyone. Bravely, Eddie battled the disease, and his long fight with cancer ended in 2002 when he declared himself clear of it. As they rejoiced at his triumph, his supporters felt a wave of relief. However, the happiness did not last. The unimaginable happened to Eddie in 2020 when his cancer returned. It was a tragic turn of events. The world was in grief as he lost his battle with the illness despite his best efforts. Even though he was just 65 years old when he died, the impact of his passing was like a lightning strike to rock music. The relationship between Eddie Van Halen and his son, Wolfgang, had always been close. Wolfgang was profoundly saddened by his father's death. As he carried the burden of his grief, the light in the world seemed to fade. In an interview with Today and Carson Daly, Wolfgang discussed his emotions. "Some days were easier than others," he said candidly when discussing the difficulty of grieving. He described mourning as a trip with no destination. The anguish remained like a shadow that would never completely go away. The struggle to accept and move on from the loss remained ongoing, as Wolfgang admitted. For him, the loss of his father would be an everlasting source of anguish. The pain grew more manageable with each passing day, and the journey itself became an accomplishment. Realizing that grieving was an ongoing process, he tackled the difficulty of it with the intention of developing better coping mechanisms over time. Memories of his father were evident when he spoke about them, helping him to persevere through the difficult times. He found solace in the love they shared, even though he had to confront the difficulty of continuing on without him. While Eddie Van Halen's death was a global loss for the rock music industry, Wolfgang Van Halen felt an even more profound void. Not only did he lose a renowned father, but he also lost his dad, his best friend and biggest cheerleader. With tears streaming down his face, he recalled their bond and how Eddie was still his extremely loving and closest friend. These remarks unveiled a deep connection, one that went beyond the realm of music. According to Wolfgang's emotional statement, his father's soul continued to influence him even after he passed away. He overcame his sadness and embraced life because of Eddie. Wolfgang was honest about the fact that he sometimes wished to run away from life. He was overcome with the overwhelming desire to flee into the shadows where the agony seemed to subside. But his father's memory jogged his limbs again, keeping him grounded. Keeping his father's memories alive gave Wolfgang strength. His resolve to press on was strengthened by the memory of Eddie's legacy. He wanted to hide away from the world and give up at times, but he knew his father would be furious if he did. In the midst of his sorrow, he felt the strength of love and was compelled to live fully in memory of his father. During those dark days, Wolfgang was saved from certain doom by the memory of Eddie, who served as a lifeline. Living life to the fullest, making music, and telling their story to the world were the ways he could commemorate his father. For Wolfgang, Eddie was more than a distant memory, he was a beacon that encouraged him to press on, follow his heart, and rediscover happiness. Thus, the hope persisted, and the father-son relationship was preserved even in the face of tragedy. Wolfgang Van Halen spent innumerable hours in the recording studio while he wasn't performing on stage with Van Halen or Tremonti. Hard work was being put into his debut album, Mammoth WVH, set to be released in 2021. The songs on this album weren't written in a vacuum, they were the culmination of years of hard work, focus, and imagination. With his whole being, Wolfgang performed every instrument, guitar, bass, and drums, on the record. He made it clear that he was the one who wrote the songs and played every instrument. This demonstrated his commitment to his art form, the unique perspective he brought to his creations, and his artistic freedom. The album's success was totally dependent on him, so he carried a great burden. There was no one to divide up the work, so if things went wrong, he could only blame himself. He went on to say that while there's a lot more pressure, there's also a lot more creative freedom, describing the mix of excitement and anxiety he felt when he took complete control of his music. He had his chance to shine, but he also had to prove himself. As the release date drew near, Wolfgang felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. In the midst of his struggles with grief and insecurity, he realized this record was about more than just the music. He used X, formerly Twitter, to reflect on the album's release a year later. It was the result of years of effort, failure, uncertainty, and worry, he wrote. The weight of his hardships was evident in these statements, which showed how far he had come. He dove headfirst into a new phase of his life, even though he wasn't sure he was ready. Moving his music on tour was the next step in this new journey. Wolfgang assembled a band of skilled musicians because he was excited to perform his music live. Wolfgang Van Halen was quite attached to the name Mammoth, and therefore, he chose it for his band. According to Wolfgang, the moniker was borrowed from a three-piece band that his father, Eddie Van Halen, had fronted before establishing Van Halen. Whenever he recounted the tale, a sense of nostalgia illuminated his words. He adored that moniker, as it was his method of paying tribute to his dad while also establishing his own musical personality. He had vowed to himself that as an adult, he would forge his own path while staying true to his heritage. By naming his album and band after himself, he was filled with anticipation as he got ready to tour. Wolfgang Van Halen was about to take center stage. Every performance was an opportunity to meet his audience and play them the music he had poured his heart and soul into. He was prepared to welcome the unknown and overcome whatever obstacles might come his way on the path that lay ahead. He paid tribute to his father's legacy and reveled in his own artistic development with each note he played. He was prepared to let his emotions and aspirations flow onto the stage, which served as his canvas. The sight of Wolfgang Van Halen and his fiancée, Andrea Alsop, making their grand entrance at the 2022 Grammys was a cause for celebration and expectation. Their friendship had developed over the years of their long-term relationship. Their journey began in the digital realm when they initially crossed paths online. October 15, 2015, the day of their first date, would come to signify a lot to them both in the years to come. They were finally prepared to take the next big step 8 years later. In a lovely ceremony at their Los Angeles home, Wolfgang and Andrea exchanged vows on the same date they went on their first date. With only around 90 immediate relatives and friends in attendance, the ceremony was small but magnificent, celebrating their love and paying tribute to the individuals who meant the most to them. Their aim was straightforward yet profound. In their wedding vows, Andrea emphasized that they wanted their loved ones to join them in happy celebration of their union and the love they shared. On this joyous occasion, they wished that everyone could share in the joy and love that enveloped them. Wolfgang discovered a heartfelt way to remember his late father, the renowned Eddie Van Halen, as he got ready for this historic event. He decided to play Star 316 an instrumental composition composed by his father, as they made their way down the aisle. This personal touch elevated the ceremony from a simple wedding to a meaningful memorial service. Wolfgang thought it would be a touching tribute to his father to have Eddie's music played during the ceremony, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The air was charged with a blend of love, nostalgia, and optimism, creating an evocative and memorable ambience. With a mix of pleasure and delight, Valerie Bertinelli, Wolfgang's mother, observed the ceremony. Her heart soared with excitement as she learned her son had found his soulmate. She said in awe of the bond between Andrea and Wolfgang, "They truly understand one another. They support each other in a natural and reassuring way because they have comparable interests and a common sense of humor. They belong together." It was obvious. Achieving new heights in both his personal and professional lives, Wolfgang's career was flourishing. He was quickly rising to fame in the music world, with his Grammy nomination, a spectacular concert tour, and his debut record. But the situation was about to escalate further. One of the most anticipated Barbie movies of 2023 asked him to compose the score. This was no ordinary opportunity, it was a platform for him to demonstrate his talent to an international audience. Ryan Gosling's Hallmark musical piece, I'm Just Ken, features Wolfgang's guitar abilities. Noticing that he would be performing with Guns N' Roses' famed guitarist further added to the excitement. The atmosphere was electric as the two were ready to cheer for Gosling at the 2024 Academy Awards. This would be a watershed event for Wolfgang, as it put him in front of the largest audience of his career. By this point, Wolfgang Van Halen was an accomplished musician, prepared to conquer the world. He was more than just the son of a rock superstar, he had every opportunity to demonstrate his mettle as the rightful successor to the Van Halen moniker. As he took the stage, prepared to embrace his moment of revelation, the tension was palpable. He was about to go on a trip that would shape his identity as both a man and an artist. The past and the future loomed large over Wolfgang Van Halen as he stood at the crossroads. The great Eddie Van Halen, his father, had a huge influence, and he was well aware of it. Everyone thought he would just mimic his renowned father's playing and singing style. However, Wolfgang remained resolute in his pursuit of musical independence. He aspired to be more than just his famous father's son. He wanted to have his own unique sound and style as a musician, just like Wolfgang Van Halen. Regardless of the reaction, Wolfgang stated in an interview with GuitarGod that he would remain authentic. It was inevitable, he knew, that some would draw parallels between him and his father. That was expected. The music of the late, legendary Eddie Van Halen had altered the course of guitar music in an irrevocable way. However, Wolfgang sensed an increasing self-assurance. People began to recognize him for more than just his family tree as they grew to love his music and his personality. His father had always urged him to follow his own path and not follow the crowd. This piece of advice constantly crossed his mind. He was led to be the artist he always dreamed of being by those words, which shone brightly and helped him overcome his doubts. Like and subscribe if you want to see more discoveries like these.